Welcome back to fall 2022. I think we all got back into being in person, if I look at you guys. Welcome, sorry about the chairs, make yourself comfortable somehow. Try and keep the walking lanes a little bit open. But welcome to our opening lecture. I think we could not have had a better opening lecture. I usually don't start with personal things, but many of us here and many of your faculty are actually graduates of Columbia, including this one. And we all have a lot to thank to Bernard Tschumi, who is our guest tonight. Bernard Tschumi is many things. He's an architect, a theorist, a writer, an educator, and of course a multinational, like we all are. Monday, we all heard, I think if you were at convocation, you probably were, 42 countries that we cover, and it's quite an amazing thing. So Bernard Tschumi was born in Switzerland and is the son of a very well-known Swiss architect, Jean Tschumi. And actually, what I loved was on your website, Bernard, is that your father's work was in a retrospective in 2021. So last year, in Paris, in La Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine. My French is, yeah, okay, that. I'll ask you how to pronounce it later. Bernard himself is a graduate of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. We know that as the ETH in Zurich. And he has taught architecture at a range of institutions, among which the Architecture Association in London, Princeton University, and the Cooper Union in New York. And of course, he is currently a professor at Columbia. But we know him, as I just mentioned, as the illustrious Dean of Columbia, where he was Dean from '88 to 2003, and really made Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation into what it was, a well-known international architecture school that really was a collection of all the young architects and all the ambitious architecture students in the world. And I have to say, if I did anything right, it really is thanks to Bernard, who was an inspiration for all of us in leadership, in how to put inspirational people together, and in how to keep architecture in the foreground. I'm going back to his history because it's an interesting one. In 1975, after his studies in the ETH, Bernard moved to New York, where he was invited to teach at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, established by fellow deconstructivist architect Peter Eisenman. Peter has been here as well. And it's really interesting that you were there. I actually did not know that. But there, the teaching there, and of course his teaching at the AA in London, is where the intertwining concepts of event and movement in architecture are developed by Bernard. They supported his belief that architecture is the most important innovation in our time, and often references other disciplines in his work, such as literature and film, proving that architecture must participate in culture's polemics and to question its foundations. He used deconstructivist concepts of disorder and contrast to develop radical theories about how to inject ideas of movement, spectacle, and event into architecture, what he describes as the tension between concept and experience of space. An opportunity to test his theoretical ideas in the built world was when he was winning the project in 1983 for the competition to develop the Parc de la Villette in Paris, which he later developed with the architect Colin Fournier. This is also when Bernard Tschumi Architects was founded, also in 1983, with offices in Paris and New York. Parc de la Villette, of course, is a 125-acre cultural park based on activities as much as nature. We all know the little red pavilions, right? Today, the park welcomes over 10 million visitors annually, and in 2017, Parc de la Villette was designated a 20th century landmark by the French Minister of Culture, Azoulay. There are many books that I could mention in relationship to Bernard's work. I will include a few. There is a comprehensive monograph titled Architectural Concepts, Red is Not a Color, which narrates Tschumi's career in work and ideas since the 1970s and was published by Rizzoli in 2012. The four-part Event Cities series by MIT Press in 1994, 2000, 2005, and 2010. Of course, the illustrious Manhattan Transcripts. If you don't know them, make sure you know them. By the Academy Editions and St. Martin's Press, 1981 and 1994. I have one of them in my wall in my office. Architecture and Disjunction by MIT Press, 1994, is translated only in 8 languages. And of course, Tschumi's work has been exhibited in solo exhibits in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Netherlands Architecture Institute in Rotterdam, the Pompidou Center in Paris, as well as many other museums and galleries in the United States and Europe. I could not be happier to welcome Bernard here with us at Weitzman Architecture. Welcome, Bernard.
Thank you, Winka, who is, beside being a very talented educational leader and educator, also a very, very talented architect. It's always very difficult to hear this type of biography, right? One feels like one is dead already. But in many ways, it's also a pleasure to hear a sort of chronology, because the chronology does correspond to something else, which I would call an exploration, a sort of a way to explore territories which architecture does extremely well. In other words, the very nature of architecture, the fact that it's simultaneously quite conceptual and also extremely immediate, right? We are always surrounded or we are touching pieces of architecture. It's also very much the context of our everyday life. So this sort of opposition between something which is very abstract and something which could not be more immediate is very much what I would like to talk about now, tonight. And possibly, indeed, do it in a slightly, I apologize here, of a chronological and almost biographical manner. But that's interesting to do when you find out that when you start as a young architect, you know actually very, very little about architecture. Architecture is an old person's game in a way. There's so much to know about our environment, about our technologies, our climate resources, that it takes quite a while to put everything together. But luckily, one is always able to take shortcuts and do things from very early on. So what I would like to do is simply to talk a little bit about some architectural issues. I use the word architecture on purpose because in the early days, I never used the word architecture. I thought architecture was something which was very sort of reactionary or completely predictable, and preferred to use other words, trying to avoid some of those received ideas. So what I would like to do now is to retrace a trajectory, and rather to do it not necessarily to explain what architecture is, but somehow to explain that nothing is static, that the way we work is always in flux. So, I've been told I was not supposed to touch the keyboard, so let me move. Okay. So, there'll be some images, but there'll be also some words. And the words are about some of the, how can I say, I could call it the traps that we all are caught when we do the work that we do. In other words, I would call them zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, and genius loci, the spirit of the place. Now, those are very cliche-like things. However, what is interesting in those two covers, one is Life magazine, special issues in 1968, showing something which was an entirely new concept at the time, something very abstract. It was a view of the Earth as seen from the moon. In other words, something that was completely real but totally abstract at the time. Space, zeitgeist, spirit of the time. Now, what is interesting about it, at the time it seemed a complete abstraction. Now, roughly almost 50 years later, more than 50 years later, what am I saying? We have a situation where we have become extremely aware of the planet and its finite resources. So something that was completely abstract 50 years ago has become extremely present to what we do today. Amusingly enough, roughly the same year, another magazine plays with the idea of the genius of the place, but with images which are, interestingly enough, instead of being very present and very immediate, are actually quite abstract, that view of the ideal city. This city does not exist anymore. So this reversal of the abstract and the immediate reality is really what this discussion is about today. And so the architecture is always caught in those oppositions. Space versus time, solid versus void, define versus activate, a wall defines, a column activates, organic versus dialectic. Frank Lloyd Wright is supposedly organic, Le Corbusier is supposedly dialectic. So these opposition, nature versus culture, order versus chaos, you've heard them all. But interestingly enough, that's very much part of the way we apprehend our world. In other words, yes, Apollo, the god of the mind, versus Dionysus, the god of pleasure and everything. The pyramid and the labyrinth, the pyramid is the diagram of absolute rationality versus the labyrinth, which is, your senses, what you hear, smell, touch. And even in architecture, throughout the 20th century, or at least during the first half of the 20th century, the battle of the flat roof versus the pitch roof. And in politics, you'll have the same story, of course, with the left versus the right. So what I would like to discuss now is what happens when you work and develop the abstract moment, the concept, and what happens when it has to be confronted with reality, with immediate reality, with materiality, in other words, the context. So let me now, just as considering that the first talk of the season, describe simply that architecture is not so much a knowledge of form, but it's a form of knowledge. It's a way to apprehend, to understand the world we live in. So first I'm going to show a few slides that I show often, which are simply trying to describe what a concept is. Of course, I mentioned the perfect geometry of the pyramid. It doesn't exist in nature. And by the way, the labyrinth does not exist in nature as such. It's also a construct. It's a construct of the mind. Famous stories that I'm sure some of you know, The Little Prince, where the little prince, who is a child, is asking his mentor if the mentor can find out what this image is. And the mentor says, well, it looks like a hat. And the kid says, oh no, it's an elephant which has been devoured by a snake. This is a concept. Architecture invents concepts and materializes them by turning them into physical spaces and constructed material. In other words, again, that duality between the abstraction and the reality. Now, interestingly enough, you cannot live without concept in a sense. I'll give you a very simple example. About a little over 100 years ago, cinema was invented in its sort of the form that it had for at least almost a century. In other words, the idea of montage. The idea of montage is a pure concept. It did not exist before the 20th century, and now it's not so important in this because cinema has changed in its nature. Or, look at this. This is the studio or the living room of Sigmund Freud, the inventor, if you want, of psychoanalysis, inventing the concept of the unconscious that did not exist in the 18th century. It was a new concept that allowed a number of discoveries which had to do not only about human nature, but about language and so on. Architecture, the free plan, that's also something that is an invention. It's here, famous unbuilt project by Le Corbusier, where the repetitive grid, rational grid, is intersected by the superimposition of a movement vector, which is a ramp. In this sense, the two together makes the possibility of having something which contradicts something else. The idea of infinite space, Frederick Kiesler. Architecture is the art of building concept through spaces and materials. That's what makes it different from philosophy. That's what makes it different from, say, music. It is actually simultaneously something that has a materiality as well as something which is about ideas. Of course, I cannot come to Penn and to Philadelphia without talking about the most extraordinary. Interestingly enough, architect who was both a concept maker and an extraordinary art of material developer. In other words, you all have seen the idea of serving spaces and servant spaces by Louis Kahn. That's even this project that has always fascinated me. That's a drawing by Kahn himself, drawing a piece of Philadelphia, and with all these little arrows which signify movement. And you ask yourself, is it the street that generates the movement or the movement that generates the street? I'll come back to that. That's very important for me. Or, of course, La Villette, the superimposition of so-called point line surfaces. We'll get back to that. But this is a concept. It's not the follies. The follies are secondary to the superimposition of the three point line and surfaces. Bigness is also a complete invention. It's an abstraction, but at the same time with incredible consequences. So in other words, the general point is that you have concepts, but somehow at one moment that abstraction has, and that's the second image, takes the beginning of a materiality. In other words, you start to see what it looks like. And then affect, where it may very well have an effect on your experience, on your emotions. And these three parts of our human understanding are extremely important for the work we do. And I always like to look at a piece of work in terms of these three aspects or dimension: concept, percept, affect. Now, occasionally, it doesn't quite work as clearly as what I've described you. And you arrive at something where suddenly the circumstances, the context, start to meddle. Now, this is a fascinating house that you have all to know about. It's called the Casa Mia, or the house of Casa Malaparte. Malaparte was an Italian writer. We could go at length on the relationship between the work and what happened to this house, which was simultaneously designed by the writer, by an architect, Libera, but mostly by the writer, and where the concepts emerge out of the circumstances of the context. So I'm going to explore this correlation and trying to start to put the word context as the operator that makes a concept become what it is. So what is a concept? Context. What is a context? I think you all know that. It's almost everything which is around us. It's COVID, it's poverty, it's climate change, it's wars, it's politics, it's symbols. It's everything that we do is conditioned by context. And at the same time, we have the power through concept to modify the concept. So architecture, movement, or space. I showed you that image of the plan of Philadelphia by Louis Kahn. That fascinated me in the early days. As I mentioned, the word architecture I felt very uneasy about. It's perhaps only now that I come to grip with it. Look at this image. You see the ramp and the crowd, and you ask yourself, is it the crowd that generates the ramp, or is it the ramp that generates the movement of the crowd? And this question of the generator has been a fascinating issue because it's got nothing to do with, quote, quote, architecture with a capital A. Movement is there regardless. You could say that architecture would not exist without movement. Movement in space, but we'll come back that in. So, by the way, I'll take one back. The fascinating thing, these top left, these are spectacles organized in the 17th century. They were already drawn. On the right-hand side at the top, it's the abstract diagram of the ideal kitchen as perceived in the early 20th century. The bottom left is at the time of the Bauhaus in the 1920s, when Oskar Schlemmer, interested in dance, tries to find a diagram of movements. And the right, those of you who are very American recognize that as a diagram of football strategy, football notation. So in other words, what you draw, what you design, is somehow indirectly or directly always about movement. So movement notation fascinated me because one of the things which is difficult for us is to try to explain things which are relatively sophisticated and still be able to simplify and to clarify. This is a very early diagram from Sergei Eisenstein, one of the very early filmmakers, again, 100 years ago, for a film which I might mention in a little later tonight, where the filmmaker is trying to simultaneously show what the action will be, the soundtrack, the position of the camera, and the movement of the camera. In other words, in architecture, we have, or in much of the work that you are all doing, I was lucky enough to take the wrong entrance and to find myself in your robotics studio. At one moment, you need to write down the program. It doesn't self-generate, or if it's self-generated, it's according to the instruction that you give it. So in order to develop a mode of notation, you have to determine what are the different aspects. And that's probably, I'm showing it to you because that's what I would describe my first architectural drawing many, many years ago. Where architecture is being shown as simultaneously a series of, call them events, but there is always a space, a plan that you can draw, and a movement that you can also diagram. So this development of something which is really in your mind, but you turn it into something that eventually is buildable, was the beginning of what I eventually called the Manhattan Transcript. In other words, talking about a city. Cities seemed to be very important at that time, and simultaneously specific moments of the city. The park, and the person running in the park, there's a murder and it's like a B-movie, a mode of notation that makes it quite clearly distinct that there is that tripartite notation, the event, the action, perhaps I should be more precise, and the plan and the movement vectors. And the storyline is always in that book, which was actually an exhibition as well, or a series of exhibitions. It's really trying to develop a way to describe the work we live in a way that can be apprehended. The 33-foot long drawing, about 11 meters long, to try to do a cross-section through 42nd Street in New York, but doing it according to a mode of notation that would again use the tripartite expression with, at the top, the action or the event, in the middle, the section, and at the bottom, in this case, the plan. So developing the mental tools to apprehend circumstances which were always clearly the world we live in became very much part of the experimentation or the exploration. In other words, for about 5 years, I tested those series of issues, more of an exploration of movement and space. The fall through a tall building, or the spaces being carved inside an urban block here. Again, we are talking about New York, but it could be done in many other cities. So the idea of taking movement vectors and solidifying them so they become like walls, and then you turn them from the negative to the positive or the positive to the negative so that they become actually spaces of movement, was quite fascinating. And being in exhibited in art galleries of the time, I was asked to try to build some of these. And they were temporary constructions, some of them in New York and some in the Netherlands. And so here in the south of Manhattan, in Castle Clinton, the staircase, the movement, it would take me too long to explain. But the point is that at one moment you realize that you have an incredible power of inventing things just by changing the rules. And that was a project for the Documenta in Germany. Again, New York, two upper images, the one at the bottom in Middelburg in the Netherlands. In a way, that was probably the first exploration, not only drawing, but trying to give it a materiality. Now, some things, and is it, again, a question of the history of the time? There were more competitions during a certain period, and I hope they'll come back, than in relation to what is happening today. I had spent the last 6 years inventing programs, inventing scripts, inventing circumstances. And I thought maybe this time, let's try to do a competition, a real competition, and try to see whether I can apply some of the devices or some of the questions that I've just tried to explain in the last few minutes. And that was the Parc de la Villette, and I just did it more as an experimentation, while at the same time thinking that, well, it could be nice to win, but I didn't really put too much emphasis on that. It was simply a very large site next on the edge of the city of Paris, which used to have slaughterhouses and that were bound to be mostly demolished. And they called it a park. But a park can be so many things. You know, in the 18th century, it was one thing, 19th, 20th century. To me, it was really a piece of the city. And to organize a piece of the city, there are different strategies, whether it's the grid, the concentric circle, the axis, and so on. If you do any architectural history or urban history, you know that there are a lot of different configurations, which can come either socially, politically, or for military purposes, or for religious purposes, etc. I was quite fascinated by the fact that you have all those possible permutations. And one of them interested me actually quite a lot. I'll get back to that maybe here. It was one plan that was extremely famous, again, 100 years ago, the Le Corbusier Plan Voisin. The point grid was absolutely hated by architects and by everybody at the time. And I thought, well, maybe if everybody hates it, there must be something good about it. So try to explore what it means when you try to put those diagrams onto the site, onto the constraint of the site, choosing bottom right, choosing the point grid, and developing something which is a complete abstraction. La Villette starts purely as a concept. And then, little by little, trying to see what happens when you take those three abstraction, point, line, surfaces, what happens when you confront them to one another. And you realize that the abstraction suddenly can take a life of its own as you have to deal with all the constraints of reality. In other words, reality may be simply the constraint of the site, or the fact that there's a canal in the middle of the territory, or that you have to cover places, or that you find yourself in a dialogue with 19th century building, the 20th century city. In other words, you are in a context. So what started purely as a concept is slowly being contextualized. And activities have a way to weave their presence in there. Suddenly, we never thought of putting a film screen and having outdoor films. But in a sense, the system, the superimposition of the three items, was a generator for idea for people. So hence, continuing this exploration out of those perfect abstraction, like something called a cinematic promenade, at the beginning is nothing but a diagram. And then you start to try to build it, you contextualize it, you have to bring daylight, you have to night light, sorry. So in many ways, the question is, what do you do taking advantage of the constraints? Here, I'll just move just very briefly to see what I generally don't want to touch La Villette. I think people should take care of it. That's how we designed it. That's how it was when the park was open. And then it was too successful. The music was too loud. And the neighborhood who came to live in that area because of the park said it's too loud. We must make it forbidden to have music. So it was forbidden. And so I was asked to redesign it into an entrance pavilion. So I kept the same building, but weaved in, without touching it, a ticket counter. I'm just showing it to see that nearly 40 years ago, almost exactly 40 years ago, you can suddenly turn into something that has a further life. And just to get back, just for the pleasure of taking certain circumstances and turning it into something, that fireworks are very straightforward. But when you ask people to build fireworks for you, they just don't know how to do it. We try to design modes of notation. I was asked to do a firework for La Villette, and I developed a mode of notation and to point line surfaces and so on. And the so-called firework workers had no idea what to do with that. In other words, it was there to abstract. So I explained how it would work, make this, this, and that. And they did a fantastic job, right? In other words, turning the abstraction into a three-dimensional point line surfaces, using, of course, the La Villette color scheme. So this notion of playing with circumstances in order to take what you're trying to engage in as a type of, let's say, we architects like diagrams, we like drawings because it has a speed, has an immediacy between the hand and the mind. I'll show you a few of those projects that start with a diagram and then become, or do not perhaps become, like in this particular case. This is an opera house in Tokyo, for the Tokyo Opera House, where a mode of notation, which is like a music notation, allows you to arrange and to distribute different parts of the program, in other words, where the public is, where the musicians are, where the changing rooms are, and so on, turning it into an architectural plan, giving it a materiality, in other words, certain of the stripes are made of glass, others are made of concrete, others are made of steel. In other words, taking the concept, but materializing it, because as mentioned earlier, architecture is a materialization inevitably, and playing with those programmatic constraints and even supplementing them. I always liked this cover of a magazine that was trying to take St. Patrick Cathedral and simultaneously turning it into something else altogether. So this subversion, in a way, I may have done something wrong. So I will need the help, because I've been told, do not touch the keyboard, otherwise the house, it explodes. Will it go? Let's see.
It's a great image.
How did you flip the desktop? All right, hold on 1 second. See this for a second? Which one were you supposed to be on?
No, actually, yeah, I'm here.
That one?
Here. Now, move to that.
There
okay?
you go.
We're good. Okay. Sorry for that. I don't know if I pushed the wrong button, but that's maybe interesting. When you are confronted with that quote-quote context, you can very well supplement it, like in this particular case, a library for the National Library in Paris. I thought, well, what is the obverse of a library? How can I bring something that functionally, but also, call it programmatically, but symbolically, can alter the nature or the definition of what a library is? So added a running track. In other words, something that was, to my mind, completely the opposite of what a library is supposed to be. And the idea of the intersection of two opposite moments became one of the ways to deal with a number of issues that we inevitably are confronted with. Old and new. An old building which had been meant to be demolished, it received its demolition permit. On that site was supposed to be a sort of electronic Bauhaus, a school for multimedia arts. And I went to visit the building, and I thought, that's interesting. Walked on the roofs. I sort of liked those, the building had been abandoned for about 20 years, and it had extraordinary spaces. And I thought, yeah, why don't I try to do exactly what we're not supposed to do, which is to really keep it instead of replacing it. So asking, what if we put a big roof above it so that the building doesn't leak anymore, that the building somehow can allow me to put faces which are so much more generous than the budget that we had for it. By keeping them, I was not thinking so much about, historic preservation. I was more thinking about how you can develop a concept and taking, in this particular case, really a context and turn it into a concept. So the roof that was hovering over the neighborhood became, in a sense, a way to take a context and turning it into a concept. The new part over the old one, protecting it and so on. So in other words, it's not about form, but it is about strategy. And the strategy, in a sense, questions the form. So that's long before, actually that's just at the turning point when 3D representation, digital representation became feasible. Before that, it was just the client couldn't find out what. Yes, actually, we were just going to win the competition, and then I realized that the client had no idea what was happening, and he said, we were 2 finalists, and said that your competitor has. Well, no, he said it first, saying, you have an idea, but you have no architecture, while your competitor has architecture, but has no concept. And I realized that was dangerous and started to do those collages at midnight the night before the meeting. And so, between the new roof and the old roof was an yeah, that's interesting. These are the early 3-dimensional representation, 1994, right? That's the most sophisticated software at the time. And then you build it, and that's real. That's not a rendering. So the in-between space is the result of the strategy. It's not a result of the design. It's entirely taking a concept and conceptualizing it. Reversing expectation, I've mentioned again this interesting way of trying to bring things that are not necessarily part of what one expects. That was it still exists. It's still, people still take very good care of it in the north of the Netherlands. We were asked about, 5 or 6 architects were asked to do a small sort of shelter almost for a festival of music video. And I, instead of making it into a black box, I thought, let's turn it the other way around and make it entirely transparent and make it as a glass box, using even the glass as structure. In other words, what you see floating there is actually the beams, and the walls are all made of glass, which was unusual at the time because glass technology was really a bit in its infancy. And so that the building itself is simply made of glass pieces that are held by clips, of course, video clips of sorts. But what was fascinating is the byproduct of this, that at night, when you saw all the video screens, you would know which one was real and which one was a reflection in the glass. The fact that the building had been lifted up slightly and tilted meant that your sense of balance was completely challenged. And that's, again, trying to say, hey, what is the byproduct of taking it one step, some issue one step further? I was lucky that people enjoyed it. Instead of being dismantled at the end of the season, it has been there for nearly 30 years now, and has been the place for artist installations that change all the time, but are using literally this vehicle as a generator for ideas and concepts. So it's not only what it looks like, it's what it does. And these points, I can give you another short example of having to link between the old part of town and the new part of town, and thinking, hey, maybe that link can become something more than just a footbridge, and sort of starting to look at what it is, and realizing that you know, you can do amazing thing with structural forces. If you look carefully, you'll see that the density of the truss changes according to the static forces that are effective upon it. I did that with the architect, the young architect at the time, and fascinated by engineering, Hugh Dutton. And what we tried to do is indeed changing the density, but also making that link between the old and the new, the old city and the new one, as a place which had very much more than the breaking down of the relationship between the old and the new. So you see here how it gets extremely lighter. So that's where suddenly the context is a self-selected technology one. The context is actually structure. And how people, of course, use it, and so on. So you can play these exploration or these investigations and with ways which are always telling you a little bit over and above what you expected. A very large concert hall, 6,000 or 7,000 people. Of course, in a case like that, one of the most expensive thing is the envelope, and deciding to say that with the envelope, the outer envelope would be made of steel, that's during construction, the inner envelope would be made of concrete, and that in between you would have the movement of the different, you know, the visitors and so on. So in other words, very straightforward. The idea of the end, instead of saying there is a facade and a roof, there is an envelope, but the envelope is a double one. In between, there's something that happens. And then you can play with that and say, well, then the seats is not really what interests me. I'll make them transparent. That becomes interesting again. So, but then you find yourself, people like that building you did there, that was the site, and they give you a new site for another one. And then the context becomes quite challenging because you don't want to do the same thing. But you want to use the same concept because you know that that concept really works. The musicians work well within it and so on. But it's the middle of a forest. So there the turnaround was to say we're going to use wood for the structure and we are going to use polycarbonate for the envelope. So complete reversal of materiality. The concept is the same, but the material is reversed. So the fascinating thing is that the nature of the architectural space becomes obviously very different in relationship to what you saw early on. And you remember when I showed those three slides of, or three images of concept, percept, affect. Changing materials completely changes not only the percept but the affect. And in other words, the two buildings, while identical, are not the same at all. So this type of very self-conscious explorations is a way to investigate about what our work is. In other words, architecture is not about the conditions of design, but about the designs of conditions. One of the ones of the project I'm actually most proud of is the Acropolis Museum. I'll move like that. Yeah. Right next to one of the most influential buildings in the history of civilizations, or at least Western civilization, which is the Parthenon. Our mandate was to try, it was again a competition, was to try to find a place to house some of the incredible sculptures which were found on the site. So, and one of the challenges was that on that site that they gave us were already acres of ruins that we were not supposed to touch. So what do you do? Worse than that, much of those incredible structures, like the so-called Elgin marbles, were at the British Museum, which was not terribly friendly on the Brits at the time, to try to convince the idea of the return of the marble. So the context became really important. We didn't choose it, but we could develop a concept. And the concept became simply playing the dimension of the temple, the dimension of the place where the new building is, and the diagram, well, the ruins of the excavations. So again, this tripartite, to the fact that it's 3-part or 5-part is not terribly important. It simplifies to have few. Taking the circumstances of the constraint of the program and of the site became the mechanics of the project itself. And so that it would engage with the city, with the ruins, and with history, the history of the temple. And so in this quite amazing photograph from Iwan Baan, you see somehow that the glass room at the top is like hovering over the city of Athens. Everything else stays exactly at the height of the roofs. And you see the 3 parts of the underground, the ruins, the central space, and the glass part becomes a theme throughout the whole project. The movement vectors, of course, the transparency that goes through the glass of the courtyard, the inner court rather, that goes through the whole building so that you see people actually walking above your head, and the relationship between the concrete, the dialogue between the concrete of the new building and the marble of history becomes extremely important. It's a dialogue between the two, the perfection of the marble versus the purposefully rough concrete. And this material dialogue continues with the frieze, which is here in its, actual, this part was stayed in actually in Athens, so we insert it inside the museum. It's a little bit like that very long drawing. The fascinating thing is that in order to see this project, you have to walk around it. You cannot see it all at once. One of the difficulties that we see these days is most of us tend to look, at our, just one single image in order to make a project. In reality, it's always in motion. And so, just as that long drawing and the famous film by Eisenstein, which is about the same theme as the frieze, but that would take too long to discuss today. He wrote a fantastic, the filmmaker Eisenstein wrote a 1926 or 1931, I can't remember, writes an extraordinary article called Architecture and Montage, and says that it's really the ancient Greek that invented cinema. And takes this further. But anyway, I'll go further. A couple other examples. Concept form. A hill, a famous battle in between the Gauls and the Romans at the time, literally the time of Jesus Christ's birth, The site is quite fascinating, I think, because it's all about a series of outlines of surrounding sort of fortifications and so. And so the project, we decided to turn it, instead of doing simply one museum, to turn it into two museums, one which would be where the Roman army was, and the other one, which is on the left-hand side of this slide, and the other one, which is towards the center of the slide, where the army of the Gauls, and trying to determine with the materials, again, how we would establish that dialogue or that relationship. So the building, which is at the bottom of the hill, is made of wood, just like the constructions that were made, built or constructed by the Romans. They were made of wood for their war purposes, while the ones that were built as barriers by the Gauls were actually taking the materials which were on the site. So I'll show you just a couple images of the building on the in the valley, which is turned as a double envelope. The outer envelope is made of that wooden sort of screen. It's important that it's a wooden screen, or that it is a screen in order to protect some of the artwork and the movement vectors inside some of the. But the game here of the material becomes important with the logic of the concrete inner, the glass envelope, and the wood envelope. Some of the other views, the relationship between the building on the left, which is what you see the images with the wood and glass envelope, versus the building on the right, which has not, the second one has not been built yet. That's, in a sense, this time, taking the material of the hill and taking its, in order to prepare the foundation, using actually the leftover stone as the material of the building itself. That's a prototype that we just did, or recently did, on the hill. And then, I'm getting closer to the end, continuing after those geometric things, or strategies of trying to take it somewhere in another direction. That's the Paris Zoo, where there is something strange about zoo. You never know whether you are trapped and the animals are looking at you, or it's the other way around. So we decided to play with that and say that that's an aerial view. It's actually a quite small zoo, using exactly for people the same material as we were using for the birds, for example, aviaries. By the way, that's where I learned that the reason why you put birds in an aviary is not in order to make sure that they don't fly away. It's in order to make sure that the local birds don't come and eat the food of the exotic birds or kill the exotic birds. So the idea of taking exactly the same material of the mesh as an architectural material was extended in the way to get the places where the giraffes are fantastic animals who were actually there during the whole construction period. So, in other words, playing again with those very basic materials, envelopes, here the wood, and those are on sliding walls, so at certain days they can start to mix the different species or keep them separate, depending how the trainers see it. That's the wood before it actually ages. It becomes much grayer as it ages. That's almost brand new. And then, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, asking oneself, what does it do? and the very large tropical house, and another. So in other words, concept, not form, is what makes architecture a real meaning. So I'll just, normally I would stop here, but I can't, I'll just show you that you can continue the exploration. That's a museum in China, not far from Beijing, in Tianjin, in the Binhai area, where, again, the site used to have extraordinary industrial archaeology. I was interested in the idea of industrial archaeology. The site was changed or moved. The building changed in many ways. And the actual final, and I go very fast, play with those very large industrial spaces. This is, again, China. It's huge. This is the Guggenheim, to give you a sense of the scale. The Guggenheim is really small compared to the Binhai Science Center. This is during construction. The inner spaces themselves, and they become suddenly, that's not a rendering, that's actually the building itself, where the movement vectors of the ramp, this is before the installation. These are not rendering, they are actually photographs of the industrial sort of reminiscences of the project itself. And I'll go quickly fast again. And the project that is here, nothing but a teaser, just will open in about 2 months' time. It's just outside Paris, a million square feet, quite different, but it's again about movement, the movement vectors, and certain part of the auditoriums become their own materiality and in contradistinction to the envelope itself for Paris. That's construction, give you a sense. And if I come back, I'll show you the rest of it. Everything that I've showed you tonight is really about an investigation, an exploration about how you can take a particular field, not a discipline, but a field, and try to just simply turn it against itself in order to generate something else. Not unlike, advertisements. Advertisements are very much about proposing an alternative or proposing something. And so I go back now at the very beginning of this lecture. The first architectural work or the first design work was actually taking advertisements and turning them against themselves. The most architectural thing is the state of decay in which it is. In other words, looking at how you can take something which is deeply part of what you want to do, but questioning how to take it to your advantage. We all have constraints as architects or as designers. How can you take those designers to your advantage and enjoy it, right? And of course, taking it to extremes. So, in a way, I tried to discuss the issues of contextualizing concepts. You can also turn it the other way around. I'll do that another time. But in many ways, contexts are not avoidable. You have to contextualize it in the world we live in. And possibly, really, it's all about content. Thank you very much. Sure.
And is there, for you or for others, another way which is equally important to think about architecture and all of the things you discussed? So is dichotomy absolutely essential for the production and the discussion of architecture in your work in architecture and in architectural education?
Thank you for the question, of course. Duality is a construct, and all constructs, it can be challenged and has to be challenged. Too much of our Western mental framework has been built on dualities. And in many ways, the whole talk tonight is about questioning the idea of duality. And simply by taking two extreme aspects, one which is the complete abstraction and the other one the immediate presence, is probably my attempt to show one of the dilemma, again a duality, that we are always confronted with. Taking it to the extreme and then trying to bring them together. So in many ways, I could give the talk the other way and saying conceptualizing context. In other words, taking something which is immediate and local, but turning into something which is absolute and abstract. It's, of course, mechanisms. It's not much more than that. But we always use certain mechanisms in order to build anything. And so you refer to the talk. The talk is constructed. And indeed it is constructed simultaneously, almost chronologically, which is absolutely the messiest thing to do. In other words, you have very little control over chronology. However, you have a fair amount of control over what you're trying to do with it. And so it's under no circumstances an attempt to resurrect the idea of bipolar or whatever sexual or anything you want to call it. It's really about the tools that you can use in order to explore the field you're interested in.
Hi. Thank you very much for giving this talk to us. I'm a third-year master's student, so I'm about to graduate the MR program. But I also have a bit of background in engineering. And I'm wondering, I was very surprised to see in the presentation you gave of how grounded your ideas seem to be. And maybe you've been keeping track of what drawings we've been producing in our studios, where I know at least some of us feel like there's been a detachment between our drawings and its constructability. And I wonder what's your opinion on that when it comes to the pedagogy. Because of course with an engineering mentality that is not acceptable. But I'm wondering how you feel about that detachment, since everything you've been doing here has been built or has a very grounded reasoning behind it.
Let me try to answer through a bit of an anecdote. When we do buildings, we have to work with engineers. And I've noticed that they were, I simplify, but there were two very distinct attitudes among the engineers I was working with. There were those who were saying, yeah, let me go back to the office so I can calculate. And there was others who were saying, on the fly, just saying, well, you know, this could happen, and so on. Where the discussion was really about an engineering investigation that had to do also with concept. I probably could do exactly the same talk as I've done tonight, not using a single architectural example, but only showing a precedent in the history of engineering, whether it is steel, concrete, wood, or anything. So it's much more a question of not what it looks like, but what it does. And what it does is very much part of how you give your interpretation. It's not just about calculation. It's about how you frame the problem. And in many ways, much of these discussions that I tried to bring tonight, each of those projects is like a discussion, is in order to generate knowledge.
Would you say that whatever form you design, you have to justify it using a function or to solve a problem?
Justification. It all depends, I have to say. There are times you have to justify. People might feel not understand exactly what is happening otherwise. However, often you'd be surprised. You don't have to as one says in art, the work speaks for itself. I may have had to justify La Villette in the early days. I don't have to do it anymore. I may have had to justify the Acropolis Museum. I don't have to do it anymore. So, in other words, there's a moment when there's a text and a subtext that are superfluous because the entity or whatever, in this case, those buildings, exist on their own. And that's what they are supposed to do.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Mr. Bernard. I'm your huge fan, and thank you for the lecture tonight. And I got a mountain of your books on my table. I read it every day, and I really think the deconstructivism is the peak, the golden time of the contemporary architecture, and I really appreciate the idea of the superimposition. I would like to know, what do you think superimposition in your 20s or maybe 40 years ago, like when you were as young as me, because when I proposed the deconstructivism design, my professor said that's old-fashioned, that's not suitable for today, because they said that's for the specific time and era at that time, but that's not for today. What do you think? Like, do you think I can still use your design myself, or what do you think when as young as me? What do you think at that time? I really want to know.
I may not be answering the question exactly. The era we are in with the mask and the distortion of the voice, but I'm going to try to bring one thing that really interests me at this moment. I tried to hint at it when I showed this image of the planet Earth as seen from a satellite or from the moon, and realizing that it was not a scientific abstraction, but it was now, today, in the first quarter of the 21st century, an absolutely fundamental way to look at where we are and what we are, and realizing that we've been able to identify the issues about, say, climate change, but we have not been able yet to conceptualize it. In other words, there are plenty of examples. When I showed you these different concepts of how you invent montage in cinema, or the unconscious in philosophy, or the plan libre, the free plan in architecture, I tend to think that at the moment we are just in the very beginning of something new, which will have to be, and which is even survival, conceptualizing climate change, which we're not doing it yet. And I think that's probably the challenge of the next few decades. I would leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.